mean, I just describe myself as a yoga unity activist, because whether I'm doing like dances on Instagram and pointing to things, or writing, or working in communities locally, it's really about creating unity and working towards that. That's why I'm here in this world. So thank you. And just to check in, because I'm just joining you and I don't know where you're all coming, what you're coming from, is should I jump into what I was going to share? Or are you taking a little break? What's your kind of framing?
Yeah, you can jump right in. We are ready for you. We are excited to have you. And I just made you the host, so you should be able to share your presentation.
Okay, great.
Yes.
And I have a puppy who may try to come in. All right, here we go. All right, share my screen. Okay. So today I wanted to share about embracing yoga's roots, this ancient practice in our world today. Can you all see my screen? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. And so we've taken some time to breathe and welcome ourselves. I am coming to you from Timucua and Seminole land, unceded Timucua and Seminole land, colonized as Orlando, Florida. And I come to you also with the awareness of, in this moment, there's so much up for Asian folks, and it's not lost on me that you've invited me to be your closing keynote. And so as someone who, I'm Indian and have grown up as someone who's shy and who's quiet and who often was socialized externally and also internalized, being seen and not heard, that in this moment of speaking up, speaking out, raising my voice, I feel like I'm doing that not just for myself, but for so many others. And so I just wanted to invite us to take a moment to honor the lineage and acknowledge the lineage of yoga and all of the teachers and students from South Asia, from Northeast Africa, who have brought this practice here to us. And then also to honor and we'll take a moment of silence to acknowledge the hate crimes that happened this week, and to acknowledge those, and just standing and raising our voices for those who can't always speak. And also, if we're the ones who are feeling silenced, to receive the support we need to speak up. So we'll take a moment. I invite you to close your eyes or let your gaze rest on something in front of you. Deep breath in and exhale with a sound. If I need to move energy out, process, sometimes I'll take a deep breath in and exhale in two parts like this. So I invite you to breathe in a way that served you in this moment. One more big breath. And then shifting and coming back into our circle. If your eyes were closed, coming back into the space. So as we explore how we embrace yoga's roots, I invite you to think about what brought you to yoga. And as I share, I'll go through sharing my screen and stopping sharing just so I can see more of you more directly. Um, but when I think about what brought you to yoga, there may be some folks in here who only have been practicing for a few years or months, and that's wonderful. There may be folks who have had yoga as part of their life for their entire lives, and it's been part of their culture and their background and their history. Maybe folks who've practiced for 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. And so for each of us, there's been a way into this practice, and our ways in may look different, although there may be overlapping themes. And so what brought you to this practice? And I'll share what brought me to this practice. I am an Indian and British immigrant, and my whole life, really, I feel like has prepared me to embrace yoga and cultural issues. I'm someone whose life has been deeply impacted by the separation of racism and colonization. And yoga has been the path back to unifying myself with myself. And so I'm going to stop sharing for a second while I just take some time to share my story, because when invited to do a closing keynote, one of the things that felt so important to me was to actually give voice to the stories that are often silenced, and the stories that are very personal and yet universal. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. But my personal story is my mom is British, my father's Indian, and they met in England at a time when, this is in the late 70s or mid 70s, when people were not having interracial marriages. It just wasn't done. So it was pretty unheard of. They met and they fell in love. And even though they decided to get married, they could not find anyone who would marry them. And my mom's family said to her, one, we're not going to come to your wedding, but two, if you get married, you'll have to adopt, or else you'll have half-breeds. And luckily, they still chose to move ahead. My father didn't tell his family that he was getting married because to a British person, because they would have asked him to come back and marry and, have an arranged marriage. So they found eventually someone to marry them, and they had their own children, of which I was the first. And then there's my brother. And even from before my life began, there was already that experience of separation, already that experience of being not wanted or not accepted. And so I was born into a world that continued to give those messages to me and my family. And for many of us in this space, this may have also been true for you. And many of us tend to believe those messages. And I was one of the people who did. And so even though on the outside I fought, both in England and then later on when we moved to the United States, we moved essentially as refugees from the violence that was happening against Indian and Pakistani and mixed race families in England. We moved to Los Angeles, and my family thought, back then people were using the salad bowl metaphor, like the salad bowl will all fit in and everyone will accept us. But we moved to an area of LA where there was still a lot of white supremacy. And I think perhaps it wouldn't have necessarily mattered where we had moved. And so those same things, like go home, later on it became terrorists. At the time it was like the enemy, all those words kept coming. And so physically on the outside I fought, but inside those words were going in. And so I started to believe that I was less than. I started to believe I wasn't worthy, and became very quiet and very shy and very turned inwards. And so even though I wanted to embrace and appreciate the rich and amazing culture that I was being brought up around, my family in LA were all my Assamese and Bengali aunts and uncles. And so if I couldn't sleep, or if I was stressed out about a test or dealing with anxiety, which was something I dealt with a lot, my family would give me tools that were yogic tools, meditations, breath work, different herbs or practices that come from the sibling science of yoga, which is Ayurveda. And so I had all of these tools kind of in this toolkit. But there was a huge disconnect because I was also trying to deny who I was, and fit in with the dominant society when I wasn't fighting back against the discrimination I was experiencing. So I was in college in my first year and having a lot of panic attacks. And I found this local YMCA yoga asana class. And it was one of those gem of a teacher. Some of you may be that teacher. Some of you may have had teachers like this, where I don't remember much about the teacher. The class was right after an African dance class. So I did the African dance class, and then I went and did the yoga asana class. And they brought in yoga philosophy. They brought in ahimsa. They invited us, this is in like the 90s. So they invited us to practice accessibly. And I remember laying on the floor in balasana in child's pose and just like having tears stream down my face, because I understood in that moment that there was a way to connect my mind and my heart and my body in a practice that actually was part of my heritage. And so I'm so grateful to that teacher, because it was in that moment that I knew that yoga was going to be a path back home to myself. And so that truly, even though it had been a part of my life and kind of in the backdrop, that moment was the beginning of a journey home to myself and being more at choice with the experiences that I was having. And so then, and I'll share again, thank you. I went to India because I looked all around me for a way to learn yoga more deeply in Los Angeles, but no studio or space or training or, teaching space looked like what I knew yoga was, both in the Bay Area where I was in school or in LA where I ended up living after school. And so I went to India, and this is some images of me. This is in Sevagram Ashram in Wardha, the Gandhi Ashram, with my family in Assam, and at Deer Park, which is a Buddhist site where the Buddha gave a famous talk. And I turned into the practice in order to find my own sovereignty, my own self-rule, and to come home to myself. And so I also share this in the book that I wrote, Embrace Yoga's Roots. But what I think is most important is to say that all of this, what I wrote and what I shared, is that journey, but it's also from the teachings of the teachers I learned from. So naming Shankarji, Kabirji, who are both in Bihar and who I lived with for a few years and practiced with, Satish Kumar, Dr. Tara Sethia, Arundhati Roy, Dr. Vandana Shiva, Aisha Mason, Dr. Reverend Lawson, and others. And these are the living ancestors. They're all living teachers who I've been fortunate enough to learn from and to learn alongside and to sit with and to practice with. And so the other important thing about my story is I'm a practitioner in the West, right? Although I've lived in India and I have family there, I live in the West and I work amongst a complex dynamic of institutions that have dominated and taken over what yoga is. And I sometimes work within those institutions. And I believe that change can happen by working within institutions. And I also think that you all have the power to create our own systems. And so one example is something I did in 2019, which was the first yoga summit that I did not see queer folks, bigger body folks, Black and brown folks in any yoga summits anywhere. And so I created the Honor, Don't Appropriate Yoga Summit, which some folks may have watched, and is available for free, the first season of it, which for me, the vision was, after this, no place has an excuse. They can't say, oh, we couldn't find any Black or brown teachers. Oh, we couldn't find any trans or queer teachers or bigger body teachers. It's like, here they are. Here we are. We're out here. Hire us, platform us. And so I like to share kind of where I'm coming from, because it's important to know what makes up someone's story, and also the perspective from that I'm going to share with you around how we honor yoga's roots. So my goal for this time is that we explore historical issues of appropriation, decolonizing yoga, and how we might embrace yoga's roots. And then if we have time, I'd love to hear from you all. So there's been some misunderstandings as to what yoga is in the West. And the problem with these misunderstandings is that they dilute yogic teachings to the point where yoga is barely recognizable at all. I know that we in this space know this and feel this, and that's part of why we're here in this particular summit. And within the traditions are the seeds that we need to understand how to honor the full expanse of yoga. Here, this is an image that I took from the Gandhi Ashram, which when I lived there was long after Gandhi had passed on. He was assassinated long before I was born. But there are many, many yogis and practitioners, sannyasis, renunciates, even today, right now, living by these ashram observances. And so yoga as a full lifestyle and practice, it's not a relic of the past. It is a present day practice, and it's one that we can also take on and deepen in. And so these observances might look familiar to those of you who've studied yoga philosophy, like truth, satya, nonviolence, ahimsa, chastity, energy management for lay people, not monastics or renunciates, brahmacharya, non-possession, non-stealing, asteya, bread for labor, meaning as long as you're well and not sick, you work for your meal. So you wake up, you do some sadhana, some practice, some work, then breakfast, some work, then lunch, some work, then chanting, pranayama, practice, dinner, chanting, bed, right? That's kind of the structure of life at the ashram. Fearlessness, equality of religions, swadeshi, self-rule, removal of untouchability, which in the United States context would be removal of white supremacy or anti-Blackness or any kind of sentiment of inequity or inequality. And the instruction is to live there, to live as a yogi and follow the above observances with humility and resolve. And so many of us, it's like, well, how can we translate this into our life here and now? How can we live our yoga not as just something we do on the mat, but something we do in our relationships, in our activism, in our workplace, with our families, with our friends? And this is really what it means to embrace and honor yoga's roots, I believe. And part of why I think that is, just to explain, when I went to India, it was to connect with my own culture and my family, but also I was in a master's program and I was doing research on storytelling and representation, and how as a young person, I had not seen people that look like me in any books that I read. And so I was looking at, well, who's telling the story? Who is telling the story of what yoga is and how yoga and these spiritual traditions show up? And so I interviewed sannyasis and villagers all over, especially North India, mainly North India. And most of them said, in fact, all of them said, that yoga is a practice that comes from the subcontinent of India and has been practiced, passed down, codified, and developed for somewhere between, and most of them said 5,000 and 10,000 years. 2,500 is more of what we can find dated by Western scholars here in the US. And so I bring that point up to say, well, who are we using? Are we looking from within the tradition or outside of the tradition when we acknowledge where we're getting our data or facts from? And at the same time, the other thing that I was really looking to understand is, like, how do we both embrace the roots of yoga, but also bring the practice to the people that we're around today? So it's kind of a balance of honoring the roots, but not staying so focused on the tradition that we miss the opportunity to bring the practice to who is right in front of us. And so just as an example, my main teacher, Shankarji, he works in Bihar. He was born a Brahmin, a Hindu Brahmin, and spends most of his time teaching outcast or Dalit folks yoga philosophy and yogic practices, because to him, the greatest way he can embody yoga and ahimsa in particular, non-harm, is to take the practice and teach it to those who need it and have not had access to it. And so when I left from studying with him and still in contact with him, but not in his presence because he's still in Bihar. But when I left, he said, look, your job is to go and take this practice to the communities and the places that need it most. Yes, you need to preserve the tradition as much as you can, but it needs to be accessible. It needs to be relevant. It needs to speak to the communities that you're in contact with. And so for me, when I came back, that was teen parents. That was, I was working in a school with young people who were leaving school because of gang affiliation or other reasons. And so I would go into the classroom, I wasn't going to go in and say, let's do some yoga. I went in and said, look, let's explore like power and powerlessness and where you feel like you have power in your life and where you feel like you don't. This is one thing I've done that's made me feel more powerful. Would you like to try it with me? And so slowly, we moved towards, by the middle of the year, a pretty consistent breathwork practice. And then by 3/4 of the way through the year, we were doing some yoga asana. But if I had walked in there and said, we're going to do some yoga, this is a practice, of Indian philosophy, like they wouldn't have been interested. So it was doing it in a way that made sense and that worked with the community, while from my side, respecting the ultimate intention of the practice, which was ahimsa and freedom. Okay, so let's reflect for a moment. Has there been a time in your life when yoga felt inaccessible to you? And for some of us in this conversation, it may feel very inaccessible. And for others, it may have always felt like we just belonged, we fit in. And so why might yoga feel and be inaccessible to some? And I invite you to consider multiple and intersectional issues such as class, race, gender, culture, and also how issues of accessibility and who feels welcome can start before folks even enter the studio or the online space. And so who might be left out and why? And I'll pause to just say, if anyone wants to share in the chat, who is left out? Who might be left out? Have you felt left out? And I know I certainly have, and I still even do in the studio spaces in the city where I live. There are not folks who look like me primarily practicing in the studios and certainly not teaching. Yeah, other abled people. Brittany, thank you. There's so many folks. And when I did that Honor, Don't Appropriate Yoga Summit, pretty much every Black, brown, trans, queer, bigger body person said, I don't feel welcome. I have not felt welcome. There are definitely more trans and non-binary teachers. And I'm finding there's a lot of teachers who still feel they don't need to move their teaching. Yeah. Yeah, it's shifting, right? It is, the culture is shifting, and we all, like you all, are part of creating that shift. It depends where you live. It really does. It really does. Because why this matters? Well, yoga is unity, right? And so if we really think about still, like what percentage of big yoga studios, brands, online spaces are led by Indians, Desis, BIPOC, right? Queer folks, trans folks, YTTs, books, festivals, classes. It is shifting, but still the majority culture looks just like normative culture. Why is this? Well, white supremacy, right? Oppression, capitalism. And so yoga is union, and whatever causes separation within ourselves or with others is not yoga. Whatever leads us towards more equity, towards more unity, is yoga. And so here's where we come to, well, what does it look like today to honor, to embrace yoga's roots? Well, it's to create equity. And that sometimes means, for some of us in this space, centering ourselves, centering our joy, centering our pleasure, centering our voices. And also, for those of us who have different particular privileges, and I include myself in that, it looks like uplifting other folks. If I get invited in, bringing in other people into that space with me. At its root, yoga is a practical, structured, scientific framework, art, and embodiment practice that aims at curing personal and social ills. And it is made up of many different parts, as we mentioned earlier: the ethics, yamas, the niyamas, the inner codes, asana, the physical practice, pranayama, breath work, pratyahara, sensory focus, dharana, mindfulness, dhyana, meditation, samadhi, bliss, and union. And it's certainly, part of what it means to embrace the roots of yoga is to explore how it's far more than just movement. And even when we're teaching movement, asana, to perhaps bring in or name mantra, mudra, if it's appropriate, breath work, if it's appropriate, and it makes sense in that space, meditation, and more. And so just as we're exploring how to do this, let's define what cultural appropriation is, and then explore cultural appreciation, and we'll close on that, how we can appreciate and not appropriate. The Oxford English Dictionary says cultural appropriation is the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas of one person or society by members of another, and typically more dominant people or society. And so it's always based in a system of oppression and involves power imbalance and harm to the source culture. And there's a way that when a dominant culture can just come in and take from a culture that it is other cultures that are being oppressed, that every aspect of that culture becomes almost like, it's like we're puppets, right? And we're just being played with and toyed with and manipulated for their gain or their pleasure or their pocketbook. And so explore where you might see this at play in the yoga industry or yoga spaces. It's really, really prevalent. From people wearing bindis as decorations to the use of deities as signaling more of a spiritual space, but without necessarily respecting or understanding what those deities are. Here's two examples: power imbalance and harm. These are sannyasis, these are renunciates over here wearing traditional clothing, having maybe been to a puja or a practice where they adorn themselves, they have mala and they have different markings. And here, literally this year, when I went to costume stores to shop for a costume for my kiddo who's 8, we saw costumes that were our culture, that were Indian culture. And so this is harmful. Another example here is a Gucci model wearing a turban, a dastar, that Sikh people, S-I-K-H, the Sikh religion, which has influenced yoga and has been influenced by yoga, although yoga is not a religion, it's grown up alongside Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, and later Christianity, and been influenced by it, as well as influenced these different traditions. And so Sikh folks, some wear turbans as part of their faith, the dastar is part of their faith, and even are marginalized, made fun of, targeted, and even killed for wearing turbans. But here it was sold for this hat, which was called the Indy, I-N-D-Y turban, for $2,000. It's also a symbol in the Sikh faith of humility and of like non-attachment to possessions. And so it just is, it's so disrespectful, one, and then two, harmful, because the very thing that folks from within the tradition are marginalized or harmed for, folks from the dominant culture can take on and off with impunity. And so this happens all over in yogic culture and all over in many of our cultures and traditions. So as we're looking for, one, like acknowledging the harm, And if we're from the dominant culture, like feeling the pain of that, feeling the guilt, but not stopping there, not getting stuck in that, because it's not productive, it's not helpful for anyone to stay in guilt. And it's also for those of us who are from the traditions, like having the places to go and vent and to process and to restore our own sovereignty. So how do we appreciate, right? To me, appreciating rather than appropriating, it's really about creativity. It's about creativity and connection. And so to start, cultural appropriation seeks to, one, connect with ourselves, right? That's the creativity part, like look into our own cultures, look into our own practices. But when we're connecting with others, because sometimes the counter argument I hear is like, it's just globalization, Susanna, like this is just what happens. Well, sure, but as we globalize, as we connect with other cultures, let's do it with respect for those cultures from the inside out. So learning about the codes, the mores, the values, the practices of the culture. So for example, even just when I moved to the South from LA, where I live now in Florida, I knew that there was so much I did not know about Southern culture and about living in Florida and what that was like. And so when I moved, and I'm just talking about activist culture here, I wasn't, I had lots of ideas of what I wanted to do and what change I wanted to help make. But instead of like jumping out and trying to lead, whatever would have probably been misguided on my part with my vision, I went to local nonprofits and got to know them and got to connect and volunteered. So then I could actually understand the issues that were really pressing for folks in this community, which were different actually than the issues that were pressing in some ways, some overlaps and some differences than the issues that were pressing where I lived in Los Angeles. And so even something like that, right? When it's like West Coast, East Coast, or South, just the different culture was important for me to come and then be humble and learn and connect. So cultural appreciation can happen when one enjoys or respects the culture of origin and instead of harming or taking, gives back and uplifts the source culture. To be really clear, since cultural appropriation involves power imbalance and harm, cultural appreciation, you can assess for yourself, right? My goal is not that you leave here and you're like, I have to get her book or listen to what Susanna says. No, but that you can look at a situation and say, ooh, there's a power imbalance and there's harm. That is clearly cultural appropriation. What can I do about it? Well, or what can they do about it? They can explore how to balance power and how to create non-harm. So how can I or we share power or use privilege or advantage to uplift and support others? And two, reduce or mitigate harm by actively uplifting the source culture and its people. And that can include financial, social, political, emotional, and cultural care and support. And so finally, one simple concrete thing we can all do is acknowledge the lineage, which does not mean you have to name abusive teachers, right? Like for me, if someone is an abuser, they have disqualified themselves as a lineage holder or as a guru or as a teacher. Like you do not need to name abusers or abusive lineages, but you can acknowledge that yoga comes from India or is codified in India and South Asia and likely has been practiced in Africa and India for thousands of years. And so I always suggest people open with a spiritual lineage acknowledgement when you do your practice. A simple way to begin shifting this towards harm. Towards healing, not harm, towards healing the harm. So now, and as we close, how do you apply this to your learning, teaching, and practice? And I'll ask you that in a moment. We'll formally close with chanting Om. And in my book, which there's a free chapter on healing, on really how like trauma-informed yoga has always been a part of yogic roots. So please use that free chapter, photocopy it, share it. I tried to pull the most useful chapter that I could think of and make it free and available to all. So you can photocopy it, share it far and wide. But in it talks about many of the tools, and the sound of Om is one of the fundamental tools from within the yogic tradition. It harmonizes our nervous systems. It also harmonizes ourselves with the elements. So it's 4 parts. Ah is from the base of the spine to the navel, which is like the energy of creation, and harmonizes earth and water. From the navel to the throat, ooh, so ah is kind of broad out, open, and then focused to ooh, that which pervades and sustains, fire element. And then the lips close and vibrates in the throat, and the nasal cavity, the brain, that which transforms and transcends and is air and space. And so we'll chant Om 3 times if you would like to chant with me. And I'll invite you to let your hands rest wherever you would like, and take a full deep breath in and out. And inhale. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Shakti Shakti Shakti. Om power, power, power. And thank you for having me here. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your practice.
Thank you so much, Susanna. It was really amazing to just hear your presentation, how you speak, and thank you for making the time and weekend to be here. We'd love to, before we jump into the next part, our kind of closing journaling segment, if it's okay, maybe just keeping the space open. If anybody has anything they want to put into the chat box, or any feelings, responses, anything that's coming up before we say goodbye to Susanna. Or Susanna, you're also welcome to stay for our final journaling segment if you'd like to as well too. But I honor your time, and that's definitely not required or expected.
Thank you, Tiger. I'm so excited to connect with you more soon and happy to see you. Yeah. Yeah. I am also, if anyone has questions or anything that came up, I really 100% believe that it's all of us, all of you who should be teaching, who should be taking up space, who should be teaching our communities, right? For the allies in the space, like, take up the space, interrupt the harm, speak up. We need you to do that so we don't have to. And then for the Black folks, the brown folks, the queer folks, the trans folks, the disabled folks, like, we need us, and we need all of us, and our people need all of us. And so just keep doing what you're doing. Keep resourcing and asking for support and offering support as you can. Yeah. So if you have any questions, I'm available for that.
And I'll share in our recap email that goes out tomorrow the link to get that free chapter.
Yes.
All your handles and all of that too. So we'll make sure that gets out last of that release.
There we are. Yes. Just Embrace Yoga's Roots book. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I am going to go and play with my kiddo. Probably jump on the trampoline. It's one of those evenings. So thanks. And yeah, sending you all joy. Oh, I need to make you host.
Oh yeah, let me take that back.
Yes, I made you host. All right. Bye.
All right. Wow. Well, thank you guys. We're going to pass it to Brittany now. Brittany will take us to our final segment of the.
Yes, that was wonderful. Very informative. I'm grateful for her being able to be present for this and sharing that information and also her own story. That's very personal and also very brave. Um, so it's actually a pretty great segue into our closing ceremony here, which is just going to build on the meditation we did the first night and yesterday evening. Make sure you have your journals that has your list of identities listed. And for those of you who weren't able to join us those first couple of evenings, you can take a couple of minutes here, and if you'd like to start your list, you're welcome to do so. So we began a list of our identities, the things that define us, these labels, these titles that we put on ourselves or that society puts on us. And that could be your ethnic associations, that could be your occupation, that could be your sexual orientation, your sexual identification, that can be just anything or any label that which you show up in the world as that has an impact on your experience in the world. Also, for those who have already started your list, maybe you've had more time to think about things to add. We did talk about some more abstract labels and titles like different or outcast or weird, or even just other, quote, other. It's just something that stands out in which you felt like your existence wasn't normalized, or even if you felt marginalized, or just any identifier, even perhaps having to do with your financial status, middle class, upper class, or if you felt like poor, living in poverty, and the different labels that may come with that. And I do encourage you to look at the recordings for Friday evening and Saturday evening, both if you weren't able to join us and also if you were, just to continue reflect on those identities, perhaps build on those lists, continue to reflect on the associations and the burdens that come with those identities, um, and also the privileges that come with some of these identities as well. So maybe about 2 more minutes, just to write things down, to think about your list, to think about these associations and how you personally have been impacted by these identities, and perhaps how you have impacted others by showing up in any space as that identity. That's okay, Casey. We'll be connecting soon. That's all right. So maybe just a few more seconds, wrapping up those lists and associations. And of course, again, don't let me rush you if you're still finishing your thought. Feel free to do that. But once you are ready, you can find a nice, comfortable but tall seat wherever you are. If you're in a chair, making sure your feet are connected and rooted down into the floor. Spine nice and straight. And when you're ready, we'll find a soft gaze or close our eyes, whatever feels comfortable and safe for you in this moment. And then we'll take 2 deep cleansing breaths together. And then we'll focus our mind's eye on the titles and labels on our list. The various ways in which we show up in the world. How we think about ourselves, how others think of us, perhaps. The impact and the weight of these titles. And also the privilege of these titles. And just feeling that, experiencing it fully in this moment, in your body, in your thoughts. And today in our yoga practice, we were introduced to our chakras, some of our energy centers. Perhaps we can also reflect on how these identities show up in our energetic bodies. Noticing where you feel this, what parts of your body, the nature of the sensation. And let's begin to take 2 more deep cleansing breaths with each other. And letting your body become relaxed. Noticing that if thinking on these things altered your breath, how that feels. As we sit with these definitions, we have an opportunity to reshape what they are, what they mean, and how they look. As we've learned today and throughout the weekend, over time, so much has changed about our realities as human beings. From language and symbolism and numbers to how we can understand ourselves as parts and as a whole, as a system, how we can integrate it all. How, even though we are individuals, we are living as a collective whole with one another. Just as the parts of our body and our being sometimes appear separate, but are only parts of a working whole. And when we make an effort to integrate and to heal and to operate in that wholeness, we can not only clarify our understanding of self and the collective, but we can pave the way for healing for ourselves and for each other. So as we continue to reflect on our titles, our labels, our identifiers, and the privilege that we hold in some of these identities, begin to go down the line and consider ways in which you can use the platform of that privilege to create change in your own life, and how that might ripple out into the world. Perhaps you can even use this time to reconsider the associations and the experience of our oppressed identities and find ourselves empowered by our experience simply because we've made it to this point in time and that we've overcome enough to exist here and now and have this experience with each other. And that perhaps on your list, you can add the label of survivor. And that even now or in time, you can add to your list the identity of change maker.